I'm going to be talking about why your integration strategy will fail. It will fail to probably get a digital advantage, but it could downright fail. And these are some of the reasons that I think are the most common and a little bit surprising, since I think they're related to integration technology in the way that people and architects need to be involved. And as we go into this, I'm just gonna, there we go. So as we go into this, I want to describe what digital really means. I want to talk about the reasons for digital failure that have been identified through some of the studies and some of the great work that people like MIT, McKinsey have done. And what I've seen actually is that the underlying reason is a lack of communication, but it also relates to the way that technology has adopted in digital to support better communication. So we're going to go into that a little bit and explain why digital and fine-grained communication really works well when we start to use some of the technologies that have been called digital, like APIs and microservices. And as we go into this, we're also going to look at overall what it means to do digital integration. And then we're going to dig down and we're going to look at the business trends, what's happening, and then some of the reasons why you'll fail and the anti-patterns. With each of these anti-patterns, I'm going to present a way that we can succeed, a way that we can actually turn things around and make things work. So why will you fail? So first of all, you will fail. 75% of companies fail. Maybe you, not specifically you, but in general, people aren't doing too well. We're finding that when a digital project starts, or let me rephrase that, when a digital venture starts, 75% don't get it right. And top 3 reasons that I found were they're not getting the right information to the right worker in context. There's a lack of robust governance. And the one that really shocked me was the third one, is like being paper focused. And what that's telling me is that you're really locked into some old processes and ways of doing things that you need to get over. So if you're trying to provide digital service and you have a paper process, I really don't see how that's going to work. You know, when somebody's expecting something in seconds and you're taking hours or maybe days to get it into them. If we look at some of the reasons that I haven't seen for the failure, that's just, I think, is informative. I haven't seen anybody say, look, at messaging technology just doesn't work. I haven't seen that one. There may be challenges, but people are able to code it. There's a lot of great vendor stuff out there. I haven't seen people talk about the vendor API platform is not working, or not being able to manage APIs. And don't get me wrong, there may be issues with using it, but the vendors, by and large, have been pretty good. They actually provide people to help us out. I don't hear people saying it's Java or you should be using C++ and that's the reason everything fails or whatever.
Muted.
Not the main reason, and certainly not cloud or hyper-converged technology or anything like that. These are all just implementation mechanisms that really don't seem to indicate overall success and failure. I think the reason is that you usually know that you need to put trained people on your team to deal with these areas. So what I've done in the next slide is I've shown you sort of what the opportunity is on the left and what's really happening on the right column. So about 80% of organizations understand that digital transformation or digital business is a new thing. But about 75% of those organizations are getting it wrong because they're not empowering their employees. And you can look column to column, and really every difference is showing that the companies that fail don't understand what's really behind digital and the need to empower the people that are working on those projects, the need to make things happen really fast, the need to look at it as a new approach. And don't get me wrong, it builds on some technologies and some architecture ideas that we've had, but fundamentally, we're looking to do new things. So a little bit about me. I'm a principal architect, a thought leader. I've been in this game well over 20 years. And what I'm going to talk about on the slides today are things that I've actually seen firsthand companies do. And having worked at the enterprise architecture level, it can be very frustrating at times when people don't see it. And I think what we need to do is, first of all, recognize some of the problems that come up. And the second thing is we need to be able to raise them as architects. So I think there's an expectation as we go forward that as an architect, we understand business and we can bring business issues forward. As I go into this presentation, it's my views, nobody else's. So if you don't like it, that's me. And and that there's things you're probably not going to like in here. It's a little bit contentious. It's not necessarily the views of anyone at IASA Global or anyone else, but it does build on a lot of the concepts. When I was listening to Paul's presentation previously, he talked about canvases, and he talked about the training, to get a good architect, and really this holistic view of what they need to do and understand different things. And we build on that. And I think what's important to realize is that integration architects, when we talk about a digital role, my belief is that the integration architect is going to be front and center of this change, and we're going to see some pretty dramatic changes, and that they're going to need to add value by really bridging the team and pulling it together, not just by saying to the team, well, look at, here's the microservice pattern we want to use today. It's going to be, no, this is the product, this is how it connects, and here's how we can bring things together. Our world is changing. I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but first, let's look at some of the failures in a little bit more depth. Okay, according to the book, The Technology Fallacy, 87% of people surveyed realize they're going to be disrupted. We know that digital is changing everything. 44% said that they're not doing enough. And actually, it's even worse than that, because out of that 44%, there's a huge percentage that was just sort of saying, yeah, we're kind of doing the right thing. But it's not really the strong, yeah, we really know what we're doing. It's sort of a weaker, yeah, I think we're going the right way. And out of only 11% strongly agree that their companies are actually ready for a digital transformation. I love this quote. It really shows it up. The painful reality is that most transformations fail. Research shows that almost 70% of transformation fails, especially if you're missing some of the key factors. If you start to put them in, your odds of improvement almost triple. So you recognize a key factor and you include it, you have almost 3 times the chance of being successful. That's huge. We're going to talk to some of those things and provide some suggestions that you can take with you. So out of all the reasons that McKinsey wrote about, the top 5 that I read about were improper employee management. And again, that communication between teams, which also comes down a little bit later. A lack of engagement, a lack of overall management. I think that's a little bit overlapping though, because I think these are all kind of a lack of management. And finally, a lack of accountability. But I think the difference is between the management team and the front end, when I look at something like a lack of accountability, is who should really be accountable and has it been defined? When I look at a lack of cross-functional collaboration, is that because your team is a small team that's working together and the people just don't want to talk? Or is it because you've got organizational hierarchy and silos that you got to go across? When you talk about a lack of management, is that because leaders are trying to run the project? And are they trying to inject old ways of doing things? In fact, are they trying to run a project instead of think of it like a product? When I look at a lack of engagement, have they selected the right engagement model for what they're trying to do and for bringing out the changes? Or are they trying to do too much or something meaningless that nobody cares about? So digital success really, when you take those reasons and you sort of flip them around, it really depends on 5 things. It depends on understanding the new business model. Digital is going to be everywhere. Business is changing, industry is changing. 2, are you empowering your people? And again, that's not just about putting them in the right size groups and bringing in the right engagement model. It's also being supported by the technologies we choose. Things like APIs and microservices have that granularity that make it possible for people to engage on delivering a microservice and incremental functionality. If we all of a sudden went back to large monolithic structures, now those small teams might not work as well. But you know what? The large monolithic development projects could get by with hierarchies and silos because they weren't in this rapid feedback loop with the customer that we're now in. The other 2 things are to start small. I think the term we talk about now is minimum viable product in agile. And it's just, what do I really need to get out to start making money, and let's get it out. What they found is usually a lot of times is the first person to market is actually the winner. And finally, when it goes out to market, how do I improve my product? And that has to be done incrementally. and through experiment and feedback, and seeing what happens and getting those results. With integration, we're looking at a lot more than just the technology. We're looking at how do people, architecture, and products really get people to engage digitally. As we're talking, I just wanted to bring a clarification in terms. A lot of times we use the term digital transformation. Not that it's wrong, but at IASA we tend to use digital advantage. And I like that distinction because of a couple things. Digital advantage really talks that it's a way of life and that you're gaining an advantage by doing a change. You still need to work with what you have, but at the same time, it's sort of a process that you're working towards continuously to achieve digital advantage. I think the danger with a lot of views of digital transformation are to view it things like a project. Oh, I'm just going to have one project. I'm going to reorg my company. I'm going to do this or that, and then all of a sudden, I've transformed. It's not like that. It's a process, and I think that's really what's important here. And a lot of times, we're going to be looking at legacy companies. We're not all startups, and the question with a legacy company is, how do I get there? How does a bricks and mortar company get digital advantage? And I think what you want to start looking at is the smallest change at a time that you can make to get there. So here's, as we're going into this, a couple of predictions and why this is so important. Integration architects understand architecture and business. Well, the business is going to start changing. Everything is going to become more digital. And it's going to be more and more important to have somebody on the team that recognizes how to apply an API-driven focus and how to get things to happen. Two, we're going to have more of an API focus. That is going to happen without a doubt. As we move forward, we're starting to go into a distributed world. I mean, in the future, I can see that the distinction between what I provide as a product based on APIs that are sort of percolating up my core capabilities and the ability to bring things in from other partners, that line is going to be blurred, and it's just going to be, I want to build an application with some APIs, and well, I'll get them wherever I need to in a broader API ecosystem. Third, we need to have a product view, and it needs to be changing continuously. I like the term agile. I don't think that if you're like a traditional bricks and mortar company that a transition is out of the question. I think that you have to look at the areas that really need it on the front line. Certainly, when you start to talk about product focus and customer responsiveness, the cycles to deliver a product and be effective and get it out are shortening. So you can't go anymore and say, well, I want to have a subject matter expert interview the customer, and I'd like to have a business analyst interview the subject matter expert, and then have the architect interview the analyst. That old approach just doesn't work anymore. It's too slow. It would take, to put written requirements in place would often take months. And we've got to get new products out in days or weeks. So we do need a new way of looking at it. And I think that offers a lot of promise. You've seen this diagram in the previous discussion, and I really love it because it points to what IASA has to offer in the digital world. And it really points to the digital customer being front and center and really being about product creation and the need for that front line that's working with the customer to get information rapidly and to make things happen. At the same time, when we talk about integration, I think we're actually coming to a different place in our history than we've ever been at, and it's pretty exciting. And I love this quote by Ray Kurzweil, and he wrote some things like the singularity is near, and he talks about this convergence. As digital starts to get included in almost every industry and technology in the world, it accelerates it. And so if you look at even something like healthcare, I'll give you an example. In Canada, with this whole COVID-19 thing, doing a traditional test could take days or weeks to get results. In the meantime, Spartan came out with a box that can get that result in a day. It can actually look at the antibodies, analyze the DNA and the virus, and come back with the result right away. So here we've taken this idea of how do you build an API, how do you build an interface, and how do I integrate that maybe with non-information technology, but in another area like health. And really what we're talking about is the convergence of sensors and IoT with APIs. And we're going to see a lot of these things happening. And I think it's really important to have a person on your business team that can actually help with the possibilities. I also think that, you know, in the future, we won't be information technology integration architects. I really believe we're going to be technology integration architects, because almost every industry and technology is going to need to integrate. So as we go into this new world, some of the business trends that I expect that we're going to see, and then we talked a little bit about, is agility and speed. We talk about web scale now. I know they haven't done it with the Spartan boxes yet. I actually sent a note to their CEO on this one, and actually he thought it was a good idea. It's like, well, look, you're doing all this testing. Is there a way to anonymize it and get results back? So again, there's an opportunity to use web scale to get massive amounts of information that we can use to make a difference. We're looking at reduced cycle times. I don't think let me rephrase this, if we didn't have digital, we would not have a box that could identify and check antibodies and do virus checks in one day. These reduced cycle times are huge, and we've talked, in this case, months to get like an amazing product out end to end that I think, you know, 20 years ago would have literally taken years to develop. The costs are much lower, absolutely. You're talking, you know, equipment and costs that have gone down, and it also means that your product lifetimes are shorter and it's evolving. So that thing that you're putting out today in 2 weeks might be upgraded and replaced by a newer box. We need to deal with that. And one way we can deal with that is by reusing the good pieces and moving them forward into other projects, at the same time being able to innovate on other pieces. And most important, we need to understand what's happening. We need to fail fast. If we put something on the web, a product for people to use, you can't wait a year to find out if it's going to work. We need to find out quickly. And we don't need as much investment to do this as we used to. In the old days, I used to have to stand up a data center to make things happen. Now, I can actually do it in the cloud. I can bring it up the line. I pay for what I'm using. So if I can figure out really fast why it's not working and change it, I really cut those costs down. I mean, we're talking orders of magnitude. And so there's a huge opportunity here. And how do we do it? Well, I'm going to talk this a little bit later. This diagram that's probably a little bit hard to read breaks apart APIs and API-driven business models. So really, you know, you can look at it. There's 4 basic models for API delivery. There's free. Can I capture their attention and get them to use my product? And there's variations of that. There's the developer pays. You pay as they go? Is it based on usage? Like how many you know, widgets do they take and reuse or distribute? Is it a licensing model? We talk about things like a developer portal. And there's indirect ways of doing this too. Like for instance, do I have a referral program that I use with Amazon? Every time somebody uses my API and it refers them to Amazon, do I get a cut of the profits? All these models provide great ways for us to understand how an API itself can make money. And I'll reference this a little bit later in the anti-patterns. We also want to understand a little bit of a digital reference architecture at an enterprise level. And this is a little bit different than our, you know, our ISO model that talks to the capabilities and competencies that are required to deliver in a digital environment. I've actually based this on Jeannie Ross's book about digital transformation. And it talks to 5 major things that you need in a new digital business. You need to be able to connect with your systems of record and your existing operational backbone. This is the stuff that made your company good. And how do we integrate with it? The second part is, can I provide APIs internally to develop internal things that my people need, like internal products, and build these APIs, put them together, have my developers basically make my business easier for the internal users to run. Can I make that, can I externalize that? Can I add value in what I'm doing and create an external developer platform? I actually suspect that the two, the digital platform and the external developer views, are probably going to become converged at some point, where it becomes more of a decision of where you want to expose your ideas rather than separate boxes or separate areas. But that time remains to show that. But I think some vendors have already set up very nicely to provide that. The fourth area is around shared customer insights. And what can we learn as a company about working with our customers to make our product better quicker? And how do we take those customer insights and redevelop our product? And finally, there's an accountability framework. When we talk about people working together, we need to understand that they need to know what they need to do and their roles need to be defined. So we're not talking about getting rid of governance. What we're talking about is letting governance formally push decisions to the front line so that people can make decisions about what to do and how to do it. So this is a sample integration reference architecture. I think from our point of view, what's important to know is that there's a lot of API stuff here. And when we start talking about API consumption, we're really going to be reusing APIs in our company. We're going to expose some of them. And the other thing to keep in mind that doesn't really come out on this slide too well, but I think it's very important, is that we're going to be pulling a lot of APIs in from partner spaces. So as we go everywhere, what properties do APIs need? They need to be ubiquitous. They're going to become more common. I think they're going to be more standard. So I think you're going to see a lot of things taken over by APIs that may not have been even done by them before. And at the same time, I think we're going to be going beyond the standard, the developers use these get and post kind of constructs. I think you're also going to see some clear guidance on how to use them and when to use them. And finally, there's the infrastructure that supports the APIs. I think we're going to see that evolve into almost a fabric rather than custom type things that I need to fidget with. But that's really another sort of discussion. Let's talk about ubiquitous. Broader integrations that are going to combine non-IT, a standard for adoption so that I can use various APIs from distant systems. And I think the most surprising thing here is, why would we have different views or different types of things that are like APIs and not use them? If it's a duck and it sounds like a duck, maybe it's a duck. And the thing, I'm going to really go out and say things like identity access management. Maybe we don't need separate models to deal with them. Maybe the APIs in there can be handled in a standard way, and we're going to see that evolution as we go forward in an integration architecture. And here we see a model. I love this diagram before I came in, and it shows identity access management as a completely different layer in our integration model. But you know what? I think that layer is going to completely disappear. And I think IAM is just going to become one of the features of providing an API or component. So your company would need to, move that into one of the components you provide. And then it effectively also decouples it from the vendor, which is a really nice benefit. And they'll be standardized. I don't think we're here yet, and I think we've got a little bit of a way to go. We're talking a shared set of semantics and greater reusability than is maybe even provided in the current component model, but I think we're starting in the right place. And as infrastructure, it means code is blurring. So as a technology, it's really going to be about people trying to implement things less than it is about understanding vendor-specific kind of coding approaches, or even having to understand what the microservices are giving us to build these with. A good example of the blurring line, I just want to provide an example here. This is, it's called Intel's One API. So we know, normally we're thinking of an API as something that we deliver as part of an IT product that gets delivered over the web. Here, this idea of one API is being applied to the development of a microprocessor standard that allows different types of microprocessors to share common work or workloads and seamlessly switch between them. So you got the world of GPUs, CPUs, and high performance computing merging with one API, a standard API. So no matter what I'm doing, my languages and the things that I'm doing that support them start to look the same. And with the growth of everything, I think the standardization becomes even more important than it ever was. And again, we're just seeing it here in the software. I'm not going to talk a lot about the microservice patterns underneath. We've got a course on integration architecture that covers some of the stuff we're talking to and also gets into these patterns. I think the things like policy management are going to be important, but again, they're not really big blockers to what we're doing, right? And so we're going to go right down into the crux of why things are working the way they are, and it has to do with the granularity of what we're delivering. In the old days, we had a big monolithic software thing that we've referred to in big teams, and they took months to deliver it, and guess what? It didn't really work. And today we've gone more fine-grained, and we need to emphasize that granularity, that flavor of being fine-grained and being able to deliver something small, but a lot of small things to build our functionality. Somewhere in the middle, we had something on the way there called service-oriented architecture. I don't know if it ever could have worked. I think the problem that we face with service-oriented architecture is the coarseness of some of the services may have been their own undoing, not just from a technology point of view, but as teams tried to develop them, they may have just been too slow to get the results they needed going through the organization. And again, that's what we're up against. We're about how do teams get empowered to do work? How do we use this course functionality to enable people? And I'm going to look at 3 trends here that we're going to categorize the anti-patterns against. New types of integration, product focus, interoperability. Product focus, we're going to talk about a little bit about product delivery and what we need to put in place and what people aren't doing to put in place. So this isn't you necessarily, but if you want to follow one of these anti-patterns, it's a great way to tank your project, or sorry, to tank your digital move or your digital advantage that you want to achieve. There's a chart here that summarizes the patterns, so let's get into them. The first pattern I want to talk about is missed opportunity, and we sort of touched on this already. It's the idea I go into a situation, I don't quite know the model, and I'm looking at it like maybe it's an example where I can integrate with antibodies, and I just don't know it, and I don't recognize that I can build a tool that can actually combine testing with other software to produce a product that can tell me if somebody has COVID-19. I don't recognize that, and now we don't have a technology and half the world dies. Maybe exaggerating, but it's a missed opportunity. And why did we miss it? Well, here's some suggestions. The first one is that we can leverage approaches like business model canvas and start to look and identify that, yeah, there is a business model here, and there's ways I can be profitable, and we can actually combine that with that API graph that we showed you earlier to come up with ideas and really come up with like taking 5 minutes an idea to generate a way to get revenue from a model. And for instance, with something like the Spartan tool that we talked about, it would be very easy to put this in place and see if it's a new idea. Unfortunately, if you don't have an architect on your team, you'll probably miss this. And so this is another really important thing that architects bring to the table, is actually preventing new loss or preventing business losses like this. The next one. We have a really sleek and sexy application we want to put out. You know what it is? It's the COVID-19 test monolith. I'll put everything in there. I can test for all viruses, everything I want, and I just code it into one application. And it may not be big, but it's still a monolith. And that type of coding is fragile. I may be slow because I want to put components in there that other people can provide, but I've coded it myself and I missed that opportunity. So maybe today there's a component in here where I have to develop to test antibodies in the blood to see if they have a certain genome sequence. Well, maybe somebody a week later comes out with an advance. I need to be able to pull that in and use it. And that means I need to be able to use APIs in like a decoupled way that doesn't tie me to their implementation. Bottom line, one-offs and mini monoliths are really the same idea that we've used in the past that didn't work. What can we do about it? Well, we can use some of the IASA canvases that we have to help identify the functionality that we're doing, as well as the components that are involved. And we can actually nurture a component view. And why this is really important is those components are the reusable things. So today I may have a component that surfaces a capability I provide. Tomorrow it may work with a partner, or vice versa. Or it may even be a piece of functionality that isn't fully defined yet that I want to put in, but at least I've identified that as a responsibility. So I think the idea is that we're going to start to look at almost something like responsibility-driven design with components, where we start to categorize them by the responsibilities that they're able to put forward and offer us. Let's look at some of the product focus anti-patterns. Missing the iceberg. So I actually didn't know this. I was just doing some research for this presentation, and I learned that they actually, the lookout on the Titanic did not have binoculars. And you would think he would have. Apparently the binoculars in the Titanic were kept under lock and key, which is almost a perfect analogy to a bad policy that actually ruins an organization. It's the perfect metaphor. And so policies that don't let you see what's happening are really bad. And if the iceberg comes, well, you're not going to see it. So what are some ways we can see what our products are doing and measure their effectiveness and miss the iceberg? First, we want to understand what key performance indicators come into play. Second, we want an engagement approach that builds measurement into our product upfront. And IASA has always advocated that approach. If you're putting something in or a feature, how do you measure if it's successful? That's included even in some of the core training. We want to go to lead indicators versus lag indicators. So if somebody pulls up an application and goes, wow, this really works, that's a pretty good indicator if I can capture that information versus waiting for a sale to go in some of the business models maybe a month or two down the road. If I'm counting things that have value upfront and not waiting, that gives me a really good idea. So I think the pattern is to, or even measure things that just don't matter, like say the number of APIs we have or number of containers. They don't really give me a good sense of what the business is doing or how closely related we are to providing the services we need. So we've got a table that looks at some good versus bad APIs. A good one is the number of applications that our product supports. That's probably going to give me an idea of how much money I'm going to make from my API. A bad one is just the number of APIs. Maybe those APIs are useless and don't do anything. Or number of API calls. Maybe my architecture sucks and I'm just making unnecessary calls for some reason. So we definitely want to put the right measures in place. Another obstacle is message patterns that are too large. And one of the things that they do is they cause us to maybe go across teams as we implement things. Maybe we need to get into some entity models and pull data from our database, and it's in different areas. So rather than separate that into separate patterns, we use one big Horkin pattern to pull it all together. And it's not resilient to change. It's not really shareable. And the danger too is that it's not really putting the ability for the smaller groups to make decisions. So what we recommend here is to create shareable component libraries that we can reuse that are still fine-grained. We want to adopt a fine-grained engagement model. And that is something like an agile architecture model with defined roles and responsibilities where the product team can respond very quickly to what they need in the product, and where the component developers can actually build components. And we're going to even see a shared role with the integration architect here going between these teams. I didn't know the name for this one at first, and then I think Dilbert Executive is something we've all come across at times. It's this executive who sits down and likes to micromanage the project. And so what he's doing is he's telling everybody what technology to use, what they should be looking at, how to do it, what architecture frameworks work maybe. Maybe you ask him a decision, he's just too busy, maybe on the golf course, I don't know. All these sorts of things, not to put them in one bucket, are going to slow down your project. And some of these maybe because the executive's just too busy, or he's done things that have worked in the past. And as architects, we really need to take a seat at the table and show our leaders that we deserve to be there. And we do this by pointing out the business value of what we're doing. I know Paul talked to it a lot in his discussion. I think getting professional certification is an important step on the way there. And I also think that you need to be diplomatic about it. I think just going out and telling the Dilbert executive, hey, that doesn't work, that's kind of crazy, might be a career limiting move. So you want to do it carefully, but also point out the benefits of working and having architects on the team to help make really good decisions. Products, not projects. As we start to build smaller products and evolve them in very fast cycles, what we're finding is that there's a real pressure for a minimum viable product to get it out, and then incremental growth. And to do that and grow things incrementally, almost a service or several services at a time, through very well-defined but precisely controlled API sizes, we're going to find it a lot of pressure to deliver something, but very quickly. It's almost like finding the smallest changes that we can make and then deliver them. Agile teams are going to have a lot of pressure to identify component responsibilities, and I think this is going to be a tough area to avoid getting things thrown in your product. Well, let's just do it for the client. But we really have to take a long-term focus. And the nice thing about API-based component development, it lets us build reuse and sort of separate out product from component design that can be reused across several products. So I think that the suggestions here definitely support agile adoption. If you're in an environment that's legacy or a little bit older or a little bit more traditional, and you've got a program management office, you're probably not hooped tomorrow. It's probably still, you can do a few projects to get there. But ultimately, if you keep with the project mindset with product releases, there's going to come a point where it just doesn't work anymore and your competitor is going to win. Strategy and roadmap for digital, I think, are still critical, but not too detailed. We still need to understand what we're building out. We need to have a roadmap. We need to understand how those 5 components that Jeannie Ross suggested, things like the developer platform, the external developer platform, an accountability framework, your operations backbone, how are they going to evolve to support your digital marketing efforts? And there needs to be some thought, but not too much. If you go into too much detail, you'll lose it. And you know what? We really don't need too much detail. If you go back, 20 years ago, if I wanted to do something in a data center, I better design it all up front, because if I ordered the parts and I had a 6-month lead time and I did it wrong, that's a big deal. Now I can code something and I find out literally within minutes whether it works or not. So I don't really need to design things as much as I need to be able to experiment and monitor what's happening. At least I don't need to design them in that broad monolithic sense. What I do need to focus on is providing the backbone that lets everything interoperate. The shuffle. Okay, so you're in a company and they go, we're going digital. Here's the new head of digital. We got 5 new departments. We're just closing those 3 new ones. The bottom line is, you probably didn't ask the architects. It's probably political, and it probably still won't work because all they've done is they reshuffle things. To make things work, you really do need to empower your frontline. Apps and APIs, that's what it's really about, that balance between them and understanding how they work. In the quest to connect systems, interoperability will probably be our biggest issue as we move forward. One of the things that we can go wrong, and this is probably the most technical pattern I'll talk to, is creating architectures and patterns that create tangle. So you can get tangled components by having microservices in a complex web calling each other and not clearly resolving the requests for data. We can choose the wrong pattern. We might decide to go with a transactional pattern where we should be using an event-based pattern. And that's really going to make a huge difference in performance. Asset or base, like what are we doing? Do we need to actually have consistent database transactional executions, or can it be basically kind of like, well, we're doing something to get there? A great example is something more along the lines of a base is sort of like almost the event or the media kind of distribution networks. I don't really care. I don't need to prove that somebody got the movie they rented. I just got to get it out there, and it mainly has to get there all the time. It's just not a big deal. I don't need to count the transaction. On the other hand, we're still going to have a lot of transactional things. And then if you do have a transactional service, it's good to keep things together so they're effective, not to split them out so that you're just splitting things out with no purpose. Like maybe there's three tables I need to check, so those calls could maybe be put together. If I split them out, and then the danger is extra logic gets included with them, I don't know what's happening, different calls. But even worse in a transactional system is how do I handle the rollbacks that are going to occur? And so really we want to make sure that our architecture, and I guess the point I'm getting at here is that our architecture really needs to go in line with what we're trying to do. So this is a really big one. And again, it's really the idea here is suggesting the right pattern based on the quality attributes of my problem, and looking at it and going, well, what kind of non-functional requirements do I have here, and what's the right approach? And I was just talking a little bit about event-driven versus transactional, and this diagram just sort of helps just summarize at a high level. With the event-driven, it would just be sort of single table, very fine-grained, whereas transactional, I want to start to group transactions together so that if there is a rollback, I can do that effectively. I think the biggest problem that we're going to deal with is with interoperability and being able to use other people's stuff when we don't know what it really means. And I think we have this problem, some people believe it happened once before with the Tower of Babel, And all of a sudden I've got these APIs that I want to use, but the information on there is not presented either in a way that I understand what it means in my systems, or the syntax isn't common. How do I deal with that? That's going to be I think a really big problem going forward. And we need to make sure that as we go from API through microservices right down to the data, and ultimately, this is about me putting data from one system to another to do something. We better make sure we know what it means, because as we start to bring systems in, if we don't get that alignment, it's going to fall apart. And a really great example of this is in areas like healthcare. When you look at protocols like HL7 that really help define sort of this clinical management space, and yet they're so complex to implement when you have other vendors maybe using HL7 version 2 in their health record systems, or their office, their vendor medical systems, and they don't match the official health record. It causes some pretty big gaps that we have to deal with in a lot of work. And I think that we're going to be probably needing to move to more vendor visionary driven kind of systems here. But in the meantime, what can we do? Well, we want to make sure we understand the semantics of lining things up. We want to support standardization across APIs, and we may find that there's something like a way of looking at API calls and management that even becomes standard. And we want to be always aware of these impedance mismatches, because if we're not, we can easily hoop projects or things that we're doing. So I know we covered a lot of ground, but the bottom line is we're digital. A lot of the things that can hoop digital are because people aren't communicating. And almost every anti-pattern that we talked about today and that we went into detail is really about how people can communicate, but also use things like APIs to be more effective. And almost all the suggestions had to do with doing things like, as an architect, using the right framework and involving the right people. Because really, when you talk about canvases and frameworks, it's about showing the right concerns to the right people. So I'll open for questions, but I'd also, if you'd like to have a dialogue, get your ideas out, I'd really ask you to join our integration community. And it'd be great. And they're not always, all our discussions go, like I say, from customer to code, understanding business right down to some of the coding implications of different kinds of integration patterns. And I would also love, if you found this interesting, let me know, and connect on LinkedIn. I'd like to share ideas with you. I'll now open if there's any questions.